Everyone, I'm Daniel Schuman, Policy Director with Demand Progress. Welcome to our conversation today, where I'm going to chat about the House rules in the 117th Congress. I'm going to do the first part here as a little bit of a slideshow, and then we'll take a break and do some Q&A, and then I'll come back and do the second half. So let me turn on this super exciting screen share. And if I can actually make it work properly, we'll get going. All right, so hopefully this is working right. I know everybody here at this point is an expert with Zoom, but what we'll be doing is we'll be doing Q&A so you can ask me questions as we go through. So let's sort of dive in. So today's presentation is on the rules process. We're going to how the House adopts new rules for the next Congress, and there's going to be two parts. The first part is we're going to talk about process, like how it is that the House actually goes and adopts new rules and what the different types of rules are. And then, like I said, we'll take a quick break so that we can answer questions or address issues that rise up with respect to process. And then we'll go on to some of the main proposals that have been made. Just by way of introduction, hi everyone. I'm Daniel Schuman, Policy Director with Demand Progress. You can see my contact information below. So let's get going. So the first big question here is why does this matter? It seems like a good place to get started. And so we have this very elegant quote from former Representative John Dingell, who said, in essence, that process controls the results. He said it in a more earthy tone, and I think the quotation that we have there, even so, is like slightly sanitized from what he actually said. But the rules matter because that determines whether you win or lose and what the playing field looks like. So let's talk about a little bit the first day of the new Congress. So the Constitution sets it at January 3rd, although by statute it can be a different time. And the first thing that happens on the first day of the new Congress, which will probably be the 4th or the 5th, is the election of the Speaker. And the second thing that happens is the adoption of the House Rules of Procedure. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that happens in there with quorum calls and blah, blah, blah. But like, for our purposes, the day that the new House comes into existence, it's a clean slate. The only rules that apply are the rules that are in the US Constitution itself. There is some sort of a sense of precedent, although it's kind of shaky about how it works. But during that first day, you elect the Speaker, you adopt the House Rules of Procedure. There's a whole bunch of other announcements and other adoptions of resolution regulations that guide what happens. And in this Congress, there will also be some sort of a joint resolution on how the House and Senate will count electoral college votes. So that's what happens the first day. So, you know, until the rules are adopted, like I said, it's a state of nature, so things are kind of unsettled, but the rules package will have been worked out in advance. So we should talk about, just sort of briefly, types of rules. Aren't you excited already? So there's a number of types of rules that control how the House of Representatives functions. First, of course, there's the US Constitution. There's the House rules themselves, which is what we're talking about here. And there's a House Rules Manual and a bunch of precedents that sort of come into play. So a lot of the way the House operates are controlled by the rules of the House itself. But there's an overlapping and interlocking set of rules adopted by the Democratic Caucus and the Republican Conference. And these are what largely control who gets to be the committee chairs. Rules regarding earmarks are often done through the conference or caucus rules and not done through the chamber rules. The seniority system, there's a lot of other stuff that sort of goes in there. So it's worth keeping in mind that while a lot of things are in the House rules themselves, there are provisions there that also come from the caucus or conference rules. There's also a bunch of other stuff. There's House resolutions, there's speaker announcements, there's legislative protocols that decide like what gets on the floor in what order. These are all hyperlinked because they actually go to these documents that are mostly available online. And I will share the spreadsheet, this presentation with you later so that you can go and click on if you want to sort of drill down into all these different things. And there's also committee rules that guide how the committees operate. So there's a lot of different rules that govern how the House of Representatives operates, and we're only going to be talking about, the House rules themselves. So the House rules at the start of the new Congress are enacted through the House Rules package. So you might be thinking, well, what's in the House rules package? It's actually more than you might think. So first of all, the House doesn't usually rewrite all the rules. They readopt the prior Congress's rules for the most part, and that's, in this Congress, is contained in Section 101 of HRS 6. Then Section 102 has a whole bunch of changes to the standing rules. So this is where, like, a lot of your efforts to lobby and change things, like this is where it will go in there. And these are things that, since the House rules are readopted Congress after Congress after Congress, changes to the standing rules tend to be a little bit more set, and this is what you think of as the House rules. There's also a whole set of separate orders. The separate orders have to do with things that apply just to this current Congress, and I can give you some examples of that. So an example of a separate order is the 3-day rule, the 72-hour rule. The consensus calendar was done through a separate rule. PAYGO is done through a separate rule. What to do when members are indicted is done through this provision. Committees, commissions, and House offices are governed under Section 104. So this is another sort of additional section that is often put into the House rules. So what will happen here, like, this governs the House Democracy Partnership, the creation of the Office of Congressional Ethics, the Land Test Commission, the new Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the new Whistleblower Ombuds Office. I'm stopping for a second because I'm asking for my kids to not be on the piano. Sorry about that, everyone. So that's Section 704. Section 105 may have to do with orders of business. So this has to do with things like what happens first and sort of how that works. Now, this last Congress had sort of an unusual rules package where there was actually 2 additional titles. Title II had to do with the creation of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and Title III had to do with provisions having to do with the Affordable Care Act and challenges in court. We may see those things show up again later, or maybe not. It's unclear. We probably don't need to worry about that. It's really the stuff in sort of the first section, sections 101 to 105, that you'll probably see again. But what this means is, the House rules package is just a simple resolution. It doesn't need to be passed by the Senate. It doesn't need to be signed by the president. And it can cover things as big as the creation of offices inside the House, like the Office of the Whistleblower Ombudsman, which is generally done as a separate order. Or it controls the creation of committees, but it could also be little tiny things, like that you should be allowed to electronically submit bills, or that you could have a resolution saying that all congressional staff should have an email address that's made available in an internal database, whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be big stuff, but this is kind of the big moment for most of the things that that you might want to do in the House. Like, this is the time where most of the major rules changes are made. So you're probably asking yourself, okay, self, what's the timeline to engage in all this? Like, when can I actually have an impact? How does the Rules Committee or the leadership start thinking about this stuff? So the Rules Committee generally starts thinking about the House rules and reforming them in August. Like, this is the time where during August recess, if not a lot else is going on, they'll start thinking through what might be in the package and like what they want to change and what they've learned from the last 2 years. The House Rules Committee usually has a member day hearing. This year they had their member day hearing on October 1st. And we actually have a summary up at this link of what was discussed in the member day hearing. And members in September and October start thinking about like what they want in the rules, and some of them testify and so on. And some of the caucuses start putting stuff forward. Election day happens, November 3rd, I think, this year. And then after Election day, you have the new members show up, you know who's going to be there. The new members will be voting on the new rules package. There's going to be a new member orientation process that will go on. There'll probably be a caucus presentation from the chair of the Rules Committee about what he's thinking about including in the rules. And these are all opportunities starting now, going through October, November, and December even, where members can weigh in on what the rules are, what they should like, what they like them to be, and so on and so forth. Now, the rules, generally speaking, are partisan. The party that's in control of the House is the one that controls the rules because they will adopt the rules in their caucus or conference, and that's what gets pushed forward as the major rules package. The minority can also offer their own rules package, but they don't. My experience is that it doesn't necessarily matter if you're not in the majority. There are recommendations from the minority with respect to the rules package that can be included from time to time, as can recommendations from civil society and elsewhere. If the rule makes sense and there are members that support it, it's usually something that folks will consider. Finally, what will happen in late November or in December, the rules package will literally be drafted. You know, there's a resolution HRS 6 or HRS 5 that will say what goes in there. And then based on what goes in there, like there will be tweaking and there'll be member pushback and debate. The rules often aren't finally drafted until the end of December or the beginning of January, just a couple days before they're adopted. Republicans hold a vote, I think the day before the new Congress, when they're in control, to actually officially adopt the rules, and then things can change then, and that's happened in the past. Democrats, I don't think, do that. So for the Democrats, there'll be final language end of December, beginning of January, depending on what folks have wanted and what sort of folks are interested in. So this has been an overview of the process part. I'm going to pause now because I've thrown a lot at you in terms of process and procedure. So I'm going to get off this screen share and we'll go to Q&A for a second. But if you have questions about day one or types of rules, or the rules package, or a timeline for engagement, this is a great time that we'll do it for a couple minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the major modernization proposals that exist. So I'm going to turn off screen sharing, hopefully. So now you can see my lovely office. And if folks have questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and it says Q&A, it's next to polls. And you can go and type any questions that you might happen to have on process. I'll also open up the chat window in case folks have any chat questions. I'm not seeing any questions so far, so either I've done a great job of explaining everything or I'm on mute, one or the other. But I'll just give it a moment to see if folks have any questions about process. And if not, then I'll go into the substance. All right, well, it seems like there aren't any process questions. If you have them as we go along, go ahead and feel encouraged to add it to the Q&A. And what I'll do is I'll go through some of the major recommendations or things that are worth looking at. So let me just share my screen again. And aha, see, I'm not entirely incompetent. Here we go. All right. So where can you get rules reform ideas? Well, you can get them any place. Often it arises from problems that people have in the way that they're trying to interact with the legislative process. The rules control significantly what happens. What I put up here are a couple sources where there have been a lot of suggestions about rules reform proposals. So one source is from us. I'm with Demand Progress, and we put out recommendations in August or September. I think we put out 130 recommendations for changing the rules and adopting select orders. And don't worry, I'll share this online so you can find all the links. The Rules Committee had Member Day testimony just a couple weeks ago. We put up a summary of the 15 or 20 ideas that folks had there as well. The Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress just released their final report that has a number of recommendations for amending the rules of the House. The Progressive Caucus put out 6 rules recs recently. I'm sure they'll probably have more. And the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress held Member Day testimony last year, where there was a ton of ideas, and those are also up as well. So there's lots of places where you can sort of think through ideas. They can be big or they can be small. Let's talk just for a minute about some of the often raised modernization proposals. One of the ones that comes up a lot is the congressional calendar. People think that the congressional calendar does not work well. Members spend 65 or 66 days a year traveling to and from Congress, and 65 or 66 days in Congress, which is a lot of travel time for sort of short days in DC. So there are a lot of proposals, like the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress has recommendations out there. There's a number of other folks as well. Most of it comes down to like either a 2-week on, 2-week off, or a 3-week on, 2-week off schedule, where members would show up on Monday, stay in for Monday morning, not Monday at 5 o'clock, so they come in Sunday night. They stay in for 2 full weeks, and then at the end of 2 full weeks, they leave. If you do that, you end up with 20 travel days instead of 60 travel days and like 90 days in DC. If you go to 3 weeks on, 2 weeks off, you end up with 120 days in DC and something like 20 travel days. So you can really significantly affect the way Congress works by having more time here and less time going back and forth. There's also other ideas connected to this, things like maybe some days should be voted or some weeks should just be voted to committee work. So you have a week of committee work or you have blocks of time that can only be for committees as a way of making it easier for members to make their committee obligations. So that's one of the most often raised proposals. Another has to do with earmarks. People are trying to call it congressionally directed spending, but it's just another word for earmarks. Slightly different form. This has come up. 2 of the 3 candidates for the Appropriations Committee have raised it. The Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, I think, recommended bringing back congressionally directed spending. Leadership in both chambers, appropriators and members have talked about bringing back earmarks. There's actually no rule against earmarks. It's just a practice now that the Republicans had a rule, I think, against earmarks in their conference rules. I don't think it was actually adopted in the chamber rules at any point, but it's been a practice that's been stopped, but it can be restarted again. But a lot of the proposals that if they're going to bring back earmarks, there would be like transparency and accountability requirements that would be put into the rules about how earmarks would have to be disclosed online, and that there would be limitations on what earmarks you can get and so on and so forth. Another point of significant interest is the motion to recommit. This is that last minute motion that's made sort of at the end of the debate on a bill that the minority can bring, where they can suggest additional changes to the legislation. The majority generally hates these motions to recommit. They often view them as gotcha votes, but it is also often the one and only opportunity that the minority has to actually have a say. There's a number of suggestions on this. One suggestion is changing the level of the motion to recommit to 2/3, so the minority can still bring it, but like unless 2/3 of the chamber agree that it doesn't go forward with the amendments that the minority is proposing. We have a proposal that if the underlying bill is available for 72 hours and the motion to recommit has to be available for 24 hours, so that you can actually see what's coming and you have a chance to work it out, and there's sort of better text. One of the big concerns with motions to recommit is that they're often confusing or difficult to understand. So there are ways of addressing this, and there's a lot of different proposals. Another significant proposal has to do with contempt. So Congress has inherent contempt power. So in addition to statutory contempt, where if someone refuses to testify or lies before Congress, you can go and try to get the Attorney General to prosecute them. Congress has inherent powers, but it hasn't used them in like 100 years. Or 110 years, something like that. So in the scope of inherent contempt powers, Representative Liu has a resolution, I think that Representative Raskin has endorsed, that would go and fine people for, should the chamber hold them in contempt. I forget what the monetary amounts were. There were some concerns with how it could work, but we can talk about that further. There have been sort of, the Republicans, when they were in charge, had a way of trying to zero out salaries for federal employees. That was like another mechanism to go and sort of make these processes work with respect to contempt. I don't think this issue is fully worked through. There seems to be a lot of questions that folks have on how this would work, but it is something that matters. Oh, and I should say thank you for raising your hand. If you have a question, if you can put it in the questions, like the Q&A, just type it out. I can look at it there, and that way I can address the questions or concerns that you have. I'm going to go through the last 2 of these, and then I'll look at the Q&A that folks might have. So PAYGO is another thing that comes up a lot. PAYGO is the requirement that any bill that would increase spending by the federal government has to have some sort of equivalent cut someplace else. This is something that doesn't exist in the separate orders part of the House rules. There's been testimony by some that want to keep this. There are others who want to get rid of the PAYGO rule, in part because the House will simply weigh the PAYGO rule when it has priorities, and this is a way of keeping out a lot of like small bills or other legislation that folks care about, but they can't sort of meet this PAYGO obligation. And there's also sort of a range of conversation around like scoring, sort of generally speaking. On one hand, there's this idea for a dynamic scoring, which is basically, it tends to come from more conservative folks, oftentimes, but not always, where you would look at how like the effects of like tax cuts, for example, would have on the economy. It's rooted sort of in the Laffer curve stuff, which I don't want to get into. The current process is static scoring, which is the way CBO scores things. But there's also questions around modern monetary theory and sort of scoring things in the context of like other priorities. And the final thing that has come up a lot is continuing the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress in one format or another. This, of course, is the entity that was created at the beginning of this Congress to make recommendations for changing and upgrading and modernizing the House. It has just wrapped up its proceedings. It had 97 recommendations, which is wonderful, but it will not exist in the next Congress. So what would an ongoing Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress look like? So I'm just looking, I don't see any questions in the Q&A chat. There's one. So a question is, how does modern monetary theory impact scoring, and what's the connection? So you're asking the wrong person, because I'm not an expert by any stretch on modern monetary theory, but I will give it the old college try, and then people who actually know more can correct me when I get it wrong. So there is a long-held belief that with the federal government that money that the federal government spends must equal in some part the amount of money that it collects either through taxes or through borrowing. This doesn't really reflect the way the government operates. The way the government actually operates, right, is they go and they spend a lot of money, and then they get some of this money back or not, and we run structural deficits in the way that things work. Monetary theory would say that you don't look to trying to balance the numbers because it doesn't mean anything. What you look at is what is the point at which spending more money and increasing the amount of dollars that you print would actually have an effect on inflation, because inflation is how you know that you're actually overheating the economy and it's not trying to sort of balance the book. So you look more at questions around like, you know, is this actually affecting inflation, and not like, is it changing your theory about possibly affecting inflation? I'm sure I'm stating this really badly, and you can talk to people who are experts in MMT who could say better, but it's a different way of thinking about the way that CBO scores legislation or what type of limits there are on things that you propose. So I know that's not a great answer, but that's the best that I can do because it's not my area of expertise. There's one other question, and then I'll move on to the next section, and then I'll turn off the screen share, and we can just go straight to other Q&A. So the question is, who is responsible for collecting the members with respect to contempt? Is it the sergeant at arms or otherwise? Yeah, so it's not clear to me how that actually works. I've looked through the resolution. I think what would happen is the House would make a determination that that someone is in contempt. They would assess a fine, and then they would probably have to go to court to enforce it against the person to actually pay up for the fine that's being assessed against them. So then the question that the court would have would be more like, has this been done validly, as opposed to a question of whether the prosecution should be brought in the first place. I'm probably not stating this well. Representative Liu and Representatives Raskin are probably the folks that you should talk to about how this works. My own theory is that this probably won't, this may be able to do some of this through the rules process, but I suspect there's probably going to have to be legislation that will change the way the statutory contempt process works, because that will be something that that is more likely to vindicate the rights of the House. So there's one more question that came in, but I'm going to hold off on it and just sort of talk through a couple more rules proposals, and then I'll get out of this presentation so that we can just talk to each other. So there's a number of other rules proposals, and I just want to highlight 6 of them. One of them is that there's a lot of space here to engage in modernization around congressional staff. You can do things like improving staff benefits. So there could be a House rule that says that all members should get 12 weeks of paid parental leave. You can do that through a House resolution. Or you can, affect how student loan repayments work. So there's a lot of things that you can sort of do through this lens. There's also efforts to do things around tracking staff information diversity. So this can also be done through the rules process, where you can require an annual or biannual survey of who works in the house and how they get paid, or you could go and actually require people to fill out that information when they get hired, so you could just sort of do a data poll. And there's also a question around unionization. So there are a number of congressional staff that are unionized, not personal committee and leadership staff, but in the support offices and agencies like the Capitol Police and the Library of Congress and so on and so forth. And part of the law that allowed them to unionize allows staff inside the House to unionize should the House of Representatives adopt a resolution that puts into effect the regulation of the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights promulgated under its predecessor entity in 1995. Since there have been a lot of concerns around staff being forced to work in unsafe offices or other questions, that is something that is starting to come up more and more as well. There's also questions around ethics reform, and I'll just touch on one or two. The Republicans changed the rules with respect to how members of the board for the Office of Congressional Ethics are appointed. Previously, the majority and the minority had to agree, but they changed it where they don't have to agree, and there is concern that if you make it so that the parties can sort of unilaterally appoint, you end up with the problems that, like what we have at the FEC, where you just have a bunch of partisans, and that is problematic from a number of perspectives. So it's the idea to revert the rules to what they were when the OCU was created. Similarly, there's questions about members of Congress who engage in unethical behavior. So the House Ethics Committee will often investigate members of Congress who are engaged in inappropriate behavior, but when the member resigns or leaves for other reasons, the investigation stops. And this creates two problems. Problem one is that some members want to be vindicated and they think that the report would vindicate them, but the report can't come out because the House assumes that they're out of their jurisdiction and they can't finish it. The other is that members of Congress who've done something shady will hang on until the last possible moment and then leave before the final report comes out, and the final report then won't come out. But you can change the way the Ethics Committee operates with respect to this. Anyway, so that's some of the ethics stuff. And there's also one having to do with witness disclosures. If you're a witness, what do you have to disclose? Do you have to disclose when you get paid by a foreign entity? Yes, in theory, but there's a lot of loopholes. And I think it's Representative Porter has some suggestions on how to close a bunch of those loopholes. A couple more things, and then we'll go to the rest of the Q&A. There's a House rule. Rule 2, Clause 2 requires all reports to Congress to be listed in a report. But the way that report language works is that it only lists reports that go to the full chamber, not those that go to committee or subcommittee. So there's a proposal to make it so that there will be a list of all the reports due to Congress that are mandated by law from the executive agencies, and not just the ones that go to the chamber. And there's similar questions around access and sharing reports that are requested or required by committees. So there's a whole lot of like information sharing and access to data questions that can be resolved through the rules. There's collaboration matters, and one is that, of course, there are congressional member organizations. There used to be legislative service organizations, which were like CMOs, but on steroids. These were entities that there are congressional member organizations that could get an office, that could get a phone number, that could make it easier to hire staff. There's a proposal that would actually have the House paying for some staff that work for the LSOs, or finding like alternate mechanisms to make it work so it doesn't come out of the MRAs. If you're interested in this, there's a lot more information in the recommendations from Demand Progress. Two others, and then we'll go. One is clearances. So personal office staff aren't allowed staffers at a TS-SCI level of clearance, which means that oftentimes when they get briefed, they have problems getting access to information. So there are proposals for members who sit on committees that deal with information that's highly classified to allow their staffers to either be treated as committee staff so they can get a clearance at a higher level, or to provide clearances to like one personal office staffer at a TS-SCI level instead of a TS level. And the final thing is there's a bunch of recommendations around technology, both in terms of like providing better technology policy support to the House, and also to improving sort of some of the tools that are available. So this is the e-submission of statements for the record, or signatures, or we have a proposal for creating a legislative branch data coordination office that would allow all the different legislative branch components to better share information with each other and create sort of information better structures so that it becomes possible to have better technology that can support all of that. So there's a lot more. I'm going to stop because I've been talking for 30 minutes and I'm sure you guys are sick of it. And I'm going to go and get us out of the screen share. And let's go and address some more of your questions. So I've got a couple more. And if folks have additional questions, please feel encouraged to put it in the Q&A. So one of them is, oops, I accidentally cleared someone's that I shouldn't have. Do you foresee any changes to the privileges accorded to the delegates or resident commissioners? And do you see a Cherokee tribe being able to seat a delegate in the 117th Congress? That is an excellent question. I am fascinated by those matters, but I don't know. I don't have any information that would suggest that this is or is not going to happen. There's some interesting, well, based on the question, like there's interesting provisions from laws, from treaties, I think, that were enacted with respect to seating folks from some of the tribes. But I have no insight whatsoever as to whether that's possible or how it would work. I suspect that all of this is a leadership question. So the best person to speak to would probably be Democratic leadership. So let's go on to the next question. When are the inflection points for outside groups to influence the final rules package, and are there coalitions working on this? This is a great question as well. I'm going to stop saying this is a great question because I love the topic, so I'm sure they're all great questions. The inflection points to work on this, one was in preparation to encourage members to testify before the Rules Committee that took place on October 1st. The Rules Committee is still taking information from outside entities, so if you're at an outside entity and you want to share your recommendation with the Rules Committee, now is still a great time to do so. I suspect that after the election, things are going to be crazy inside the House, but having new members or having current members ask for these things now, like member requests or groups of member requests, member letters, is something that can be very effective. So like this is a good time to do so. I suspect in preparation for and in the lead up to whatever presentation that Chairman McGovern's going to give, or immediately afterward, will also be like another sort of one of those choke points where the amount of ideas and recommendations will narrow. I think of like your opportunities as a funnel, and with each passing day it becomes less and less likely. You can still break through, but the way to do it is either having coalitions of organizations and requesting meetings while the Rules Committee has time to meet with you, or by, because they're also going to be very busy along with House admin doing like orientation, or to go and get coalitions of members to write letters or to meet with folks from the Rules Committee. And that is a good way to do that. If you're looking for coalitions that are working on this, I'm leading one of those efforts at Demand Progress. So we are working with other organizations to try to address the process that's going on. I suspect that there are many other entities as well. I know some of the caucuses, the Tri-Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, the New Dems, I think the RSC as well, are all engaged in trying to influence what's going on. So there are aggregate entities that are trying to affect this. There's also some committee chairs, like Chairman Thompson testified with respect to jurisdiction for the Homeland Security Committee that I thought was pretty persuasive. Debbie Wasserman Schultz testified regarding creating a new subcommittee inside the Appropriations Committee. So there's probably members that are working on these things as well that are probably worth reaching out to and chatting with. So we've got two more questions. One is an incredibly hard question, which is, but I like it, which is the pros and cons of reducing seniority as a determinant for chairmanships, including in the Senate. So I won't talk about the Senate because the Senate is out of scope for this chat here, but I'm more than happy to talk about that offline in terms of how that functions. So seniority in the House. So I'm going to distinguish between seniority, so seniority for committee chairs is a very touchy issue, which seems to be changing a bit. So in the fight over the House Foreign Affairs Committee, it seems that seniority is maybe less of a determinant than it had been in years past. And this may also be true for the Appropriations Committee, where there's another fight over committee chair. So seniority is kind of a tricky thing, right? We don't have a pure seniority system now, though it's largely a seniority system. The upside of seniority, of course, is that it helps settle the fights, right? Not everybody's fighting all the time. The downside, of course, is that just because someone is the most senior member doesn't make them the most competent. There could be other members that are more competent and capable. the inability of people to move up the food chain and rapidly has created a circumstance where many people just rapidly leave the house. There are questions around independence and power for subcommittee chairs, which could be one way of addressing some of these issues. But it's worth remembering that most, questions around seniority and determinations who becomes a committee chair is really a matter of caucus rules or conference rules and not chamber rules. And that who gets to be appointed is largely controlled by leadership. The House Democrats don't release the people who sit on their steering committee, but we built a list of most of the people who are on it. And the steering committee is almost entirely controlled by the speaker. It's very leadership driven. And as a consequence, seniority is used as the prop, as a prop that's holding up the speaker in her position. Should the speaker change, having blocks of members that can help you get towards controlling the chamber is what will in turn be used to influence who becomes the committee chairs. So seniority matters, but seniority is not relevant as seniority itself, but seniority is rather relevant because the way it plays out among the different factions inside the House, and that seniority is used as a mechanism to maintain different types of factional control over who gets to be the chair and how that works. I'm happy to chat about this more. It's a very interesting and very hard question. Next question is there any restriction on what might be included in the rules? So as an extreme hypothetical, can the majority party dictate through a rule that no legislation on a particular topic can be considered, thus blocking bills or amendment without having to engage in a televised debate on the topic? So there are restrictions as to what can be included in the rules. Those restrictions largely come from the US Constitution. The House has the ability to change its rules as it goes through resolutions. In fact, the House changes its rules all the time. Every time they suspend the rules, like that is a change of how the House rules operates. The House could abolish all its committees. The House could make determination about what rules could go to the floor and which could not, although they could always have another mechanism like through the Rules Committee where they could suspend the rule that prevents the determination of certain things. So yeah, I mean, it's a majoritarian institution. The rules largely control the way the chamber operates. What limits, what like practical limits there are is, I mean, I can't imagine there's a lot coming to the fore now that the speaker wouldn't want to have come to the fore. So that's kind of where you are anyway. I'm not sure that there's a big functional difference between having a rule saying that there's no bills on X and just having the Rules Committee, which is controlled by the speaker, refusing to bring something like that to the floor. So that won't stop members from talking about things. So members would still be able to talk about things on the floor under the speech or debate clause. They can't be imprisoned elsewhere. I guess they could be ruled out of order. But no, it's very hard to think of functional limitations as to what can be included in the rules with respect to the way the House governs its own chamber. Now, with respect to things outside the House, like it has very little power there. So hopefully that is responsive to your question. Another question is, have there been any proposals that would focus on making the Hill more reachable for potential staffers who may not have the resources to take the additional route? And the answer is yes. There are a number of proposals. So the recently created Office of Diversity and Inclusion is intended as sort of one way of helping to fix the recruitment pipeline. There are proposals around paying interns, making sure that all interns are paid and that they're paid $15 an hour. That's something that can be addressed through the House rules. You still have to pay for it through appropriations, but it can be accomplished sort of through that pathway. There's efforts to track who makes it there. There is a proposal, sorry, this is a little sideways, but there's a proposal on like tracking committee witnesses to look at like diversity among that as well. There are other proposals around like it's how you recruit, how you retain, what people get paid, equalizing staff pay. So if you pay staff better, which is something that can be adopted through a resolution, which just means it can be done through the House rules, that means that to the extent that folks don't have the financial resources to become a staffer, if you pay them better, then it makes it more attainable. So there's a number of conversations around things like maybe the House should adopt like an equivalent of the GS scale, or maybe that they should go and evaluate pay ranges, and there should be a baseline pay range that nobody should be able to go below, or that people should be encouraged to be above. So there's a lot of conversation around that. Select Committee has some recs along those lines. We have a bunch of recs along the lines. There's a lot of things that can be done there. It's a really helpful question. Thank you for asking it. And the final open question, so if you've got more, this is a great time to put it in there. And after this, I guess we can wrap up. It's a question of what can prompt a congressional committee to hold a hearing on a subject or concern. This is outside the scope of the chat today, but the short answer is a congressional committee can basically hold a hearing on anything that it wants that's within its jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction itself is something that's determined inside the House rules. So with that, I think I've addressed all the questions that have been asked. I'm going to wait just a moment to see if anybody else has any more questions. And if not, I'm going to thank everyone for joining, and we'll take the video, we'll put it up on our website, and we'll create a synopsis of this afterward, and I'll put up all the links, so if folks are interested in how you can find any of these documents, we can go and make it easy for you to find all that stuff. Just a final plug before everyone goes, we do have a weekly newsletter called the First Branch Forecast, which talks about all this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in staying on top of like how Congress works and where you can find these things, the First Branch Forecast, which is at firstbranchforecast.com, is a great place to look. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call or email. Thanks, everyone. Bye.